Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down a massive severe weather event that'll be impacting the United States over the next 48 hours, bringing the risk for significant damaging winds, large hail, and perhaps a few tornadoes. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today that will lead into that severe weather potential for the next couple of days. We'll first begin with parts of the Central Plains in the Midwest, and this is where we have our low pressure system currently centered. Now, if you remember from yesterday, we had a mesoscale convective vortex across parts of the Ohio Valley that has now moved off to the north and east and weakened out quite a bit. Now we're starting to see that low pressure system intensify a little bit back over in parts of the western Midwest. And as this tracks to the east throughout the day today, it'll increase the risk for severe weather across parts of the lower Midwest and even the Ohio Valley. So we have a lot of stuff to watch for today in terms of all modes of severe weather, and we'll talk about more on this in just a moment. This will eventually move to the east and cause even a larger threat of severe weather down the road. For those along the east coast, we have a very large area to watch for severe weather going into Monday, and we'll have to watch this event pretty closely as well because, again, all modes of severe weather will be possible, so we'll be watching that event very closely as well. Back over on the west coast of the United States, there's really not a whole lot of activity here, maybe a couple of showers, maybe a storm or two back up in the northwest United States, but it's dry overall. The heat dome continues to dominate. It's a bit further down to the south and west now, but it is still bringing that relentless heat across the entire southern plains and then back through the west coast. So again, the heat is not going anywhere, unfortunately, but there will be chances of showers and storms for some of those areas that could at least bring a little bit of relief. We'll talk a little bit about that here over the next few minutes. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for the next several days, and we are going to begin with today. It's a pretty large area that we're watching for today. There are two slight risks that I would really watch for closely. It's all connected to each other, but they're kind of separate events. So the first one's back through parts of the Midwest and as well as the Ohio Valley. We're watching primarily here for some large to very large hail, maybe a few tornadoes, and as well as damaging winds. Those are the main concerns for today here across parts of the lower Midwest, and we'll talk about timing and all that in just a moment. Further down to the south, we have another slight risk of severe weather. Again, they're connected, but they're pretty much separate from each other in terms of like the timing and whatnot. So there's another slight risk of severe weather for those in Tennessee and then parts of the Dixie Alley. Marginal threat goes into parts of the Northeast through Pennsylvania, and it goes all the way back out to the west through Arkansas and as well as into Florida. So again, it's a very large area that we're watching for today. The main concern will definitely be damaging winds. So flying trampoline meter today, it's going to be on the lower side of things, but it's definitely something you want to make sure you're doing today is hatching those trampolines down or flipping them over, whichever one's easier for you, because again, flying trampolines will be possible, including loose line items, cover plants, and as well as cover your vehicles, because there will be a chance for some significant hail, especially across parts of areas basically near St. Louis and in western Illinois. This is where we do a hatched area for large to very large hail today, which means hail could go as large as the size of tennis balls, which is going to potentially damage the vehicles if you do end up seeing that threat, which again, it's going to remain isolated. Not everybody will see severe weather, but those that do could see hail as high as the size of tennis balls. Tornado threat today has increased since yesterday, but again, it's still on the lower side of things. I kind of saw this coming. 5% tornado risk. It's going to be on the lower side, though. That's going to be near the St. Louis area and as well as southern sections of Illinois. So make sure you have a tornado action plan in place today and have multiple ways to receive alerts, and make sure you're ready in case there are any power outages, meaning flashlights are on hand. Make sure your phones and also other devices are charged ahead of time, just in case, again, that you might lose some power. All right, and let's talk more about the timing here across parts of the lower Midwest, and we'll begin with those in Illinois, southeast Iowa, eastern parts of Missouri, and as well as back through Indiana. So for the rest of the morning, nothing too crazy. By the afternoon, things start to ramp up a bit, so you'll notice by about 1 to 2 o'clock, storms are going to start to increase in intensity and as well as in coverage back in parts of southeast Iowa. Main concern initially between the hours of like 12 to 3 will be isolated large hail and maybe a little bit of isolated damaging winds. Once we get closer to about 4 o'clock, that is when storms move into Illinois into a more favorable environment, and that is when we'll probably start to see these storms really ramp up in intensity with the threat of all modes of severe weather. So by 5 to 6 o'clock, storms are continuing to move into Illinois. We'll be watching two different areas, one of which will be back down near St. Louis. These will be more discrete supercells or semi-discrete. These will have a little bit better of a chance of producing the large hail concern and as well as the threat for maybe an isolated tornado or two. Further to the north, these storms will be primarily producing damaging winds with maybe a little bit of sporadic hail. Can't rule out an isolated tornado. By 7 to 8 o'clock, these storms move to the east, and by 9 to 10 o'clock, we'll have more of a cluster developing going toward Indiana, and this will be more of a damaging wind threat as it goes towards Bloomington, Terre Haute, as well as areas like Indianapolis. By midnight, storms are again more organized in a cluster, damaging winds being the main concern, up to 70 miles per hour, and by the overnight hours, this bows out out, becomes much weaker, and then that'll lead into our next sort of severe weather tomorrow, which we'll talk more about in just a moment. For those back further to the south, for those in Tennessee as well as in Kentucky, we'll be watching for storms really to fire up during the early to mid-afternoon hours. You'll notice they'll be more isolated in nature, but the ones that do develop will produce more of a damaging wind threat, so definitely make sure you're monitoring that. Eventually, by the afternoon, around 4 or 5 o'clock, storms continue to move into northern Alabama and parts of northern Georgia, and eventually going into the evening hours, most of that storm activity will weaken out, and then that cluster of storms you'll notice here will go toward Ohio overnight. It'll still produce some gusty winds, perhaps maybe some lightning, but we're not really looking at anything too significant after midnight tonight. Now, going into Monday, there is a much larger area for severe weather. We do currently have an enhanced risk of severe weather, which is quite rare, by the way, for the East Coast. It extends from Maryland and Pennsylvania all the way back through Georgia. Slight risk of severe weather from New York back into Alabama. And then a marginal threat that goes from Vermont and as well as Connecticut back through Texas. It is a very large area going into Monday. And also another slight risk of severe weather I want to point out back in the high plains. Main concerns as we go into Monday will definitely be damaging winds. That's the main concern. You'll notice that 30% probability across parts of the East Coast, really primarily just west of the East Coast. That is where the greatest risk will be in the mid-Atlantic region. Large hail is also going to be a concern, especially for those kind of in the West Virginia area, back in eastern Kentucky. Those initial storms will produce more of a large hail threat and as well as damaging winds. Maximum hailstone size for today, in my opinion, will probably be around ping pong ball sized hail. Still going to cause a little bit of damage if you see that, but it will not be nearly as significant as what we could see back over in St. Louis today in terms of the tennis ball sized hail threat. Tornado risk for tomorrow, it's a little bit more increased if you're back over in West Virginia and as well as Maryland and maybe southwest Pennsylvania. Elsewhere, it's more of a very isolated threat. So overall, again, maybe an isolated tornado or two tomorrow, but the risk of that does stay low at this time. All right, let's talk more about the timing. We'll begin with the Northeast United States. And again, you'll kind of notice there'll be some storms during the morning. These can be pretty quick moving, mainly damaging winds. By the afternoon, around 2, 3 o'clock, storms are really firing up in a very large area across parts of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. These will all be capable, again, of some damaging winds, maybe a tornado risk. The greatest tornado risk, again, is in this area here. Out of the storms will be moving west to east across parts of West Virginia and Maryland, eventually getting closer around 6 o'clock. We have more of a line of storms moving across areas like New Jersey and as well as back through Delaware and Maryland, and eventually going into the evening hours, these storms move off to the coast with maybe a little bit of isolated gusty winds and some lightning remaining for upstate New York as we go into the overnight hours. Further to the south for the mid-Atlantic, we'll be watching again for storms to fire up. A line of storms is likely to form as we get closer around 5, 6 o'clock or so, and that will be really what we're watching for some significant damaging winds for. This will be much more numerous in terms of the damaging wind threat, up to about 70 miles per hour, eventually getting closer to 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. These storms move to the east, eventually going through parts of eastern South Carolina and North Carolina, where damaging winds will be the main concern. And overnight, these storms again will weaken out quite quickly as daylight heating does end. For those in the Southeast United States, similar story here. Again, we'll have a line of storms moving through down to the south in this region, from north to south through areas like Alabama and Georgia, a little bit more scattered in nature, eventually going to the overnight hours. All those storms weaken out and move off the coast for the rest of that time. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe if you've not already.